Hello and welcome to Open Talk 2022, 2 days of conversations, insights and examples drawn from the world of business ecosystems and organizational innovation. I'm Stuart Craner, co-founder of Thinkers 50 and director of the Business Ecosystem Alliance. Our guests for this session are Joost Minnaar and Pim de Morree. Joost and Pim are the founders of the Corporate Rebels and the authors of the best-selling book with the same title, now available in 8 languages throughout the world, Chinese edition coming shortly. Over the last 2 years, Joost and Pim have been working on a book about hire and its management innovations. It was, they admit, a long, interesting and intense process. But in September, the result is published, Startup Factory. So in this session, Joost and Pim are going to talk about their work over the last 2 years, the rise of the Corporate Rebels, and the inside story of the book they've just written on Hire Startup Factory. Joost and Pim, welcome. Congratulations on the new book. And it's a while since we spoke. I think it was pre-pandemic. So how have the last 2 or 3 years been for you? I know the Corporate Rebels book came out just at the start of the pandemic.
Yeah, it's been an intense period for sure, and things changed quite a lot for our company as well, as with many others out there. Yes, so exactly like you said, a month before the pandemic hit, we launched our book, Corporate Rebels: Make Work More Fun, and we just went on one book launch tour in the UK for a very short period of time, and then we were grounded for about 2 years. But yeah, so interesting period where we couldn't travel as much to visit pioneering companies across the globe, which we normally do most of our time, to understand how they work completely different. So it's been an interesting period, but at the same time, it was quite interesting because we could dive into hire much more, research them in depth, talk to a lot of people from all across the world in different parts of hire to truly understand and get to know them. So we could actually focus quite a bit more on actually doing the research for the book, writing about it. And besides that, we launched the Corporate Rebels Academy, which has been a big change for us as a company. It's an online learning platform and community where we teach people how to make work more fun and how to run organizations in a completely different way than how traditional management prescribes. So it's been an interesting journey, and we've now been able to reach lots of people around the world in different continents and countries, and can now teach all of those people in a much more impactful way how they can actually make their workplace more fun too.
Joost, I mean, there seems to be a global interest in Corporate Rebels, and it's kind of a concept that really travels well. What is it about it that's attractive, do you think, for people throughout the world?
Good question. First of all, I think it's the big disengagement problem that many companies face, or many individuals face. I think the fact that people are not happy at work, that large amount of people are frustrated, maybe even. So this frustration leads, I think, for a lot of people to search for inspiration, how to improve the workplace and how to make it better. And we tap into that, I think, frustration, and in this search for inspiration, a big part of what we like to do is like discover inspiring stories, go there and actually report back real, honest stories about practical stuff, what people can do themselves in their daily life to change their own workplace. This, I think, is part of the drive that drives us, but also that drives the movement, or that drives Corporate Rebels forward. Besides that, I think it's the fact that people find like-minded people on our platform, on our academy as well, where they can share ideas, where they can maybe share their frustration, but also where they can share inspiration and solutions of what they do in their own workplace to make their work life better, and make their work life better not only for themselves but also for others. So this kind of search for answers, search for how to be more autonomous, how to have more meaningful work, how to make work more fun. I think this drives Corporate Rebels, and We started Corporate Rebels like 6 years ago without having any like idea how this would unfold or without any business model in mind. But now we see there is interest from all over the world, up to like China, and in October we go to Japan, for example. So it's kind of a global thing, and it's very, I would say, satisfying to be able to travel again and to visit the world and visit all these places and to report again back what we find on our way and what we can, like what kind of inspiring stories we'll find, for example, in Japan that we can share with our readers and with our followers.
And how difficult is it to put the ideas into practice? Because Corporate Rebels has grown as an organization. So people are looking to you to put the ideas into practice, which is another challenge for you, I think.
I think it depends a little bit, right, on what kind of idea you want to put into practice. Like we have courses, or we write about simple things like changing your meeting structure, or giving feedback, or like how to make decisions. These are things that you can do fairly easily, or at least in your team you can experiment in your team. But this is one part of our, like, I would say, courses and the things we write about. But we also write about organizational structures, like how to structure your organization without middle management, for example, or how to structure your organization with thousands of people, like hire in as an internal market. This is more, I would say, like sometimes MBA material. And this will be also harder to implement in your company if you are not, I would say, the top leadership or in some kind of transformational team. So that really depends. But what we see and what we practice, or we try to practice what we preach. So in our company, we try to do all those things that we write about. And yeah, sometimes it's harder than others. But if you learn from the best, most of the time, it works.
But tell me about the Corporate Rebels Academy, Pim. How does it work? What kind of? I mean, it was launched earlier this year.
Yeah, we launched last year, and we started with a 6-week course, and it goes into the topic of progressive organizational structures. So we really look at some of the world's most progressive organizations, and we go into a lot of depth on how they structure themselves to allow for more freedom, more autonomy, and more purpose to arise in the organization. So 6-week course, 20 people at the same time go through this in a class-like setting. Every week they get content, and every week we focus on one specific case study. So Hire's one, Buurtzorg Healthcare Organization is another one, and every week we have a different one, and we share a lot of content. So it's text, video interviews we've done with people working at those organizations, video animations to explain the complex things in simpler ways. And then every week, once they've gone through that content, they have a live session with one of the people who founded or are leading that specific organization. So they can go into even more depth, asking any question they'd like to a pioneer working at those progressive firms. So, and then they have a reflection session every week where they try to translate these radical ideas into their own organizations. And it might be, for example, about the topic, how can we develop one department in our organization? Or others who are a bit more radical will look at the topic of how can I reinvent my entire organizational structure to be much more focused on freedom and autonomy and purpose for people. So it's a pretty in-depth one. We launched it last year. We've been running 7 cohorts, or we've been running 6, and the next one, the 7th, is starting in September. And late September, and then we continue to run these 6-week courses. And at the beginning of this year, we launched a different type of course. What Joost just talked about, they focus on more tangible things that any person in any team can fix. So it's about meeting structures, decision making, working with roles and responsibilities instead of fixed job descriptions, how to give better feedback. And all of the people that purchase one of these courses, they come together in an online community where we organize monthly live events, social gatherings, where we have all kinds of topics they can discuss or meet up around. So it should be more than just us sharing content and insights from these pioneering organizations. And we're truly building a movement there of people from around the world who are all interested in making work more fun and who are all contributing to this change in their own organizations.
And how do you find, I'm always interested in how do you find the amazing companies in the first place? Because all the organizations you feature, I mean, are really innovative, doing fantastic things. But how do you find them?
Yeah, good question. They come from all kinds of different places. Some we hear over a beer from friends or family that we talk about this topic. Others we come across through blog posts or videos or books that we read about. And then we put them on this list. We have it up on our website on corporaterebels.com. We call it our bucket list. So the list of pioneering organizations that we want to visit. So if we are inspired by them and want to research them in more detail, we add them to the list, and then we go and visit them to actually see if what they say is as inspiring as it is, and if so, how do they do it? Because that's the question many people have, right? It's great to talk about fun at work or engaging work or meaningful work, but the question is always, how do companies actually do it? Because you can talk about self-management or non-hierarchical structures, and it sounds inspiring and a lot of people would want it. But then the question always is, how the hell do we actually do it? Because getting there and understanding how these organizations work is something completely different than just reading the inspirational story of what's possible.
And do you think the pandemic actually opened up organizations to many of these ideas? Do you think some organizations began thinking about them for the first time?
Yeah, I think some organizations are, or more organizations are open to discuss the topic of more progressive ways of working. But I think the focus is still very limited. So we love to talk nowadays about remote work or hybrid work or whatever you'd like to call it, and however companies would like to organize it. But it's just one tiny thing of an organization's way of working that you can change. So during the pandemic, a lot of companies had to move into a remote work model. But the only thing they changed is the physical working location. So nowadays, people are not in the office anymore, but they sit behind their desk at home and being on Zoom calls or Teams calls all day long. But they didn't change anything about how are decisions made, how do we communicate with one another, how can we create transparency within the team around who's working on what. There's so much more that can be done that companies haven't tapped into yet. So yeah, the discussion has definitely opened up, but there's so much more worth exploring that can really propel these companies into the future more successfully.
Are you optimistic, Joost? Are people embracing, I mean, a company like Buurtzorg, which we gave a Think at 50 award to 3 years ago, amazing organization, you've helped spread the message about them. But do you see other organizations really learning and emulating them?
Yes, there are actually quite a few experiments going on in the world. But even more, what makes me quite happy, for the last months, I was developing a teaching case with the Harvard Business School about Buurtzorg. So I spent quite some time interviewing nurses here with two professors from Harvard, Ethan Bernstein and Tatjana Sandino. And they want to develop this case as they want to teach it to all first MBA students of Harvard. And to me, that's kind of a very optimistic sign that the new generation of, I would say, top managers are actually learning in their first year about a completely alternative way of organizing, one that is much more focused on humane way of organizing, that is focused on community rather than hierarchy. So yeah, this is, to me, very early optimistic sign, but I think we are still quite in the early stages. But that's not that, I think, strange, because Buurtzorg only exists for, I think, 10 years. What we see with hires, I think hires has been quite adopted by, or the hire model, the RenDanHeYi model has been adopted by more corporate organizations, especially I think in Western Europe and Asia, and we see we get quite some signals from people that have been following our course or that have been reading our materials on our blog that are now actually experimenting with some departments implementing some form of RenDanHeYi or some form of Buurtzorg kind of model, which in the end is all quite similar, right? So we're having like a very flat hierarchy with high levels of autonomy and entrepreneurship on like small team level.
Hire was on your original bucket list, wasn't it?
On the original one, I'm not sure. I think we actually got introduced by them through Thinkers 50. I think through your work, I think we were like pointed to Hire. And for us, this was a very interesting example since it's a big manufacturing company. It's like a company in China and Asia. We didn't have many of those on our bucket list. So we always are searching for organizations that are more exotic, I would say. Like we are a little bit done with all the Silicon Valley startup stories that I think some of them might be true, but the many we visited were rather not that progressive as they were, like, I think, telling to the outside world. So we are much more looking to this kind of exotic examples in like organizations in healthcare, organizations in manufacturing. We're looking for those organizations that are in a more boring industry, I would say, and still, or legacy companies that still manage to create highly engaged workforces. And Hire is definitely one of them, and still one of the most impressive one, I would say.
Can you remember your first interactions and impressions of Hire when you went to Qingdao for the first time?
Yeah, definitely. The first interactions were first through email and WeChat, and it was actually quite hard to be able to get an invitation. But once we got one, we took the airplane directly ourselves, and we went there, I think, for Christmas time a few years ago. It was mind-blowing to us, or to me at least, like these levels of entrepreneurship of the people. And I was expecting quite of a harsh, more like I think many people that read about this kind of internal market mechanisms and the way Hire is organized. We tend to look at that from our Western view much as like kind of a harsh environment, where it's like where it's full of competition, zero-sum game like kind of environment, which wasn't. Like we actually experienced a lot of entrepreneurship, yes, for sure, but also a lot of kind of team dynamics, like people trying to help each other to reach their goals. Not necessarily full of competition and actually people trying to achieve something together, which is in the end different than beating each other.
People trying to achieve something together. Who would have thought it would catch on? So tell me about the book Startup Factory. So it's been 2 years in the making. Can you talk us through the process? And I mean, it's a great title. Let's start with the title. What does the title mean? How does it relate to Hire? And tell me a bit about how the book was created.
So the book was created indeed, like or initiated maybe even before we start writing it. But we were collaborating more and more with Hire. We did a lot of research. We went there quite often to China to learn more about it. We started to go to New Zealand to go to learn about Fisher and Paykel, how they were transforming, speaking to the people of GA in America. And at one point we said, okay, we might want to write a book about this. We might want to write like kind of like a entry-level book into RenDanHeYi, like more, not necessarily like a pure business book, but more like a general introduction to Hire, to this Chinese manufacturing company that is doing very pioneering things, and an introduction to RenDanHeYi in general, like this kind of management, new management thinking. So we started the process. We talked with Hire about getting unlimited access to the company to be able to speak to anybody we wanted to speak to interview them, and we took Bram, who's co-writer of the book, with us on board with us to start researching them. So We traveled to China a few times, interviewed many people until like Corona hit us. So I think last time I was in January, I was with Bram in China, and then in February, I think there was this big lockdown. But in the meantime, we went on. We kept doing interviews through mostly, of course, Zoom, and it was an intense. But I think writing any book is an intense process. But this one was intense in terms of language. So we had to do a lot of like Chinese resources, translated Chinese resources, which you might have experience with. That sometimes is a little bit difficult. So we wrote the first version, which was more about the history of like the history of Zhang Rumin, the history of HeYi, and the history basically of RenDanHeYi, which we describe in like 3 phases. So first, the phase of introducing the internal market mechanisms. Then the second version, which I think many people are like now aware of, the micro enterprise phase, where the 10,000 middle managers were fired, and then they introduced this kind of micro enterprise ID. And now they arrived like a few years ago, 2 years ago, I think, in the ecosystem micro community phase, where they reconnect all the micro enterprises in like little communities while they build up this like IT tool called the workbench to kind of automate all the internal bits and to introduce like external partners into their internal workings. So we first wrote that part, and then we experienced that we were missing more kind of this, what you reflected on before, like how to put those ideas into practice in your own organization. So we started to collect stories about companies that introduced at least part of this RenDanHeYi model. So we haven't found any company that has introduced all of the elements, which I think is a good thing, because I think we don't believe in this kind of copy-paste ID. But there are companies that have introduced like this micro-enterprise ID or the ecosystem micro-community ID. So we collected about 10 of those stories, and we kind of end our book with those 10 like kind of stories about like how Western and Asian companies have introduced RenDanHeYi in their own cultural context.
Pim, what about the title? Can you explain it?
Yeah, I think it's a nice reference to the type of organization that HeYi has become. So it has been a diehard manufacturing company, of course, since a very, very long time, making a lot of white goods, actually being the largest white goods manufacturer in the world. That, of course, refers to factory, but startup factory, I think, is a nice way of saying what the company nowadays has become, where you have this entrepreneurial network of micro enterprises, as Joost explained, where you have these small companies that act like startups working in a large network organization where they can truly be entrepreneurial, and therefore creating a lot of internal startups that sometimes move outside of the company borders and become independent. Others might remain more part of the HeYi network. But it really has become a company that produces startups. If you look at, for example, the basic idea of these micro enterprises is that people can come up with their own ideas for products or services. They can pitch this, and you have these internal infrastructures in place that allow these micro enterprises to start up. So they can get funding, they can get all kinds of expertise in terms of marketing, financing, HR. And therefore, these new ideas can have a really good like starting period with so much advice, so much, of course, value in the HeYi brand as well, that can get them from 0 to 1 very quickly. So you see that, for example, the success rate of these startups is 50%, where if you compare it to the industry standard, you would more look at around 10% of success for such kind of startups. So the infrastructure that HeYi has built, the way of working that it has created, really allows for people to be entrepreneurs and to start up their own companies and micro enterprises. So the company in general has become a factory for startups. So I think it's a nice reference to the kind of organization it has created.
Yeah, and if you think about the companies that you champion and write about and research, there's not many of them. I can't think of any other, which is a very large organization, which has such a strong overall philosophy across all of its activities.
Yeah, and it's also why we often call Hire the most pioneering company of our times. If you look at the skill they work on, the fact that they allow 80,000 employees to act like entrepreneurs, and as the former CEO Zhang Rumin would say, to have every person in the organization become their own CEO. I think it's of course a nice statement, and it's nice to easily quote it on social media and share it widely, and people tend to like it a lot. But actually doing something with it and moving more or beyond just the words, and actually creating an organization that becomes this platform for entrepreneurs to arise. I think it's a very unique thing, and we see it maybe in small companies as well. But most of the time, when companies grow, especially when they become as big as Hire is, most companies tend to revert to the standard bureaucratic management model.
One thing that's always struck me about Hire is it changes all the time, and it's really difficult to pin it down. You think you understand it, and then they say, but we're also doing this. And you think, oh, and having listened to Jang Rae Min talk, he'll give a talk 1 month, and then 2 or 3 months later you'll hear him talk again, and he'll have changed completely. He will have developed his ideas. So it's very difficult to pin it down, I always thought.
Yeah, I think it's a nightmare for researchers. The speed with which a company changes has definitely been a challenge for us too. When we started this project to research them and to write the book, as Joost mentioned, we focused quite strongly on the concept of micro enterprises and how they've been able to implement it and to scale it. But during our research and our writing process, we learned about this new concept of EMCs, ecosystem micro communities. And then during our research period, they tested it, they experimented with it, and then it started to grow and scale really fast within the organization. So we couldn't not include it in the book, because then we would have published a book that was already outdated on the publishing date. So and probably we still have that problem moving forward. But yeah, that's what also makes it such an interesting company to research. Like every time you go there, every time you talk to people, there are new concepts that are starting to arise or that have already found a good ground for scaling. And I think that makes it so interesting for all of us researching this organization.
I think it's interesting what Joost alluded to earlier about their global expansion and how they can export the culture to General Electric Appliances and their subsidiary in New Zealand as well. But they don't do it they do it in a very subtle way, don't they? They're not doing it in the traditional large company takes over a small company and tells it how to run itself. They've got a completely different approach.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes it so interesting. Many people hear about Hire and then they want to do the same thing. They just want to copy paste the model and implement it in their organization in the exact same way. But this is a terrible recipe for organizational change, because it oversimplifies almost all of the aspects of organizational transformation. So I think what is interesting about how Hire approaches it is that they don't force any of their subsidiaries to change towards the RenDanHeYi model, but they promote it. They explain how it works in great detail. And then if the subsidiary wants to, they will support them to implement some of these ideas. But it's always based on the philosophy, the underlying values and principles, and not so much on the specific practices. Just to take one example, like the salaries, for example, at Hire in China, they have a very low base salary. Then they have a very big part that's profit sharing based on the performance of their micro enterprise. And potentially you also have dividends if you have shares in that micro enterprise. When transforming GEA in the US, they wanted to take these ideas on board, but simply wasn't possible because of local regulations. So they had to adjust the way they approached it. The specific practice was different, but the idea of entrepreneurship and also translating that to the financial rewards and the reward structure in your organization is something you have to tweak for every specific culture, every specific country that you go to. So that's what I really like about their approach to transformation, is that they don't force it, but they simply explain how the model works, the underlying principles, what they are, and then support the organizations, their subsidiaries, if they actually want to embark on a similar transformation.
Okay, so it's what's next, do you think? Where do you think RenDanHeYi and Hire, how will that evolve over the next few years, do you think, Joost?
Oh, good question, and find it very hard to predict. I have once learned that you should never predict the future. But I think how they develop for example, this workbench and this digital way of contracting, I think it will move more into smart contracts, blockchain kind of IDs. I think there will more and more partners will be involved. So external partners will be more and more incorporated into, I would say, the higher ecosystem, like the larger higher ecosystem. I think they pinpointed, this idea of developing EMCs was to embrace more collaboration between micro enterprises. I think they kind of nailed that problem, but I'm not really aware at the moment what are the new problems, since we have not been there for 2 years. So I think what you said before, Hire is developing so fast, it would be very interesting to be able to travel there again, speak to people, and really see what are the issues they face at the front line, and how are they actually solving that. And in Hire, you can never know. Like, there might be now brewing some new ideas somewhere in the organization, and it will organically grow to like an organizational wide solution. But for now, I find it very hard to predict. The only thing I think is that more and more external partners are attracted by this idea that Hire can be your platform to start your own startup and to become your own entrepreneur. Their international expansion, I think, is interesting. I think more and more people outside China are now learning about this RenDanHeYi model being born in China. I feel more and more interest. So maybe there it might be the biggest, I think, development of Hire would be maybe outside of Hire. It would maybe like in more traditional companies trying out to implement some of this kind of morality ideas of pushing so much entrepreneurship levels and innovation levels at like the frontline level.
And what's next for the Corporate Rebels and the Corporate Rebels Academy, Pim?
Well, we've had a very good start to the academy. First 1.5 years have been behind us now. We're hiring new people because it's scaling quite rapidly. And I think one of the most interesting new ideas that we came up with recently that we're now executing on is the idea that we have this subscription model for companies. So companies can directly purchase access to the Corporate Rebels Academy for their employees, and therefore their employees gain access to all of the content that we have, to the online community with loads of other people from around the world who are reinventing their work too. So this has really caught on. We just had one announcement on our blog a couple of months ago, and it's been going crazy ever since. So we'll be scaling that idea into the future, hiring a couple of new people in the team, onboarding them to our crazy way of working as well, to get them used to this progressive way of working that we have adopted internally. And then going into the future, supporting more companies to transform the way they work.
It's not crazy at all, Pim. So Pim and Joost, authors of Startup Factory, available now. Required reading for anybody interested in the relationship between big organizations and entrepreneurial ones, and how big organizations can be hugely innovative in the way they're managed and organized. And check out Joost and Pim's first book, Corporate Rebels, now available in 8 languages, and an inspiring and insightful read. Check out their website as well. Pim and Joost, thanks very much.
Thank you, Stuart.